Hello, hello to everyone in New York, to New Jersey, Connecticut, and around the world. I'm Dr. Sam Bowden Akbari, Director of Communications at Regional Plan Association, and you're listening to RPA Radio, your one-stop shop for all things urban and regional planning in the tri-state area. Now, unless you've been living under a rock or are blissfully ignoring all media, traditional and social, you've probably heard that there's a big election coming up in New York City. It seems all eyes are on New York's mayor's race, but there's a very important set of choices New Yorkers are going to have to make on their ballots. These are the revisions to the city's charter, and they're a big deal. To set the stage for listeners a little bit, back in December of 2024, Mayor Eric Adams established the New York City Charter Revision Commission, which was tasked with reviewing the New York City Charter and determining how to make New York City's municipal government more transparent and responsive to the needs of the city. After hearing from thousands of New Yorkers and holding 12 meetings across 5 boroughs, the 2025 Charter Revision Commission submitted 5 questions before voters this fall. They'll show up on your ballots. 4 of these proposals are intended to tackle the city's housing crisis by helping to build more housing, build it faster, especially affordable housing. Those are the 4 we're going to dive into today. To help me do that, I'm joined by RPA's Moses Gates, Vice President for Housing and Neighborhood Planning. Hi, Moses. Thanks for joining RPA Radio.
Hi, it's great to be here.
At RPA, Moses leads our research, planning, and advocacy efforts around affordable housing, economic development, and urban design. He holds a master's degree in urban planning from Hunter's College, a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Wisconsin, and he's the author of the memoir Hidden Cities, which was published in 2013. Moses, I think it's pretty safe to say you consider yourself a professional New Yorker, a lover of observation decks, and are basically our Spider-Man for getting onto rooftops and other taboo spaces around the city. You want to tell our listeners a little bit more of that history and about yourself?
Sure. So I am currently a almost 50-year-old dad and have left much of the Spider-Manning behind me in my life, but I have always just aspired to be a professional New Yorker. I love this town. I want to learn everything about it. I want to see everything, and hopefully I want to be able to give back a little bit. So I had a time in life that I think actually a lot of New Yorkers go through where, they just get intensely curious and interested in the city. And if you are the kind of person who likes to talk to people, maybe you just find yourself talking to a lot of different people in a lot of different places. And if you're the kind of person who likes to read books, you start digging into the library and just reading about the history of New York. And if you're the kind of person who likes the built environment and wants to be a city planner, you find yourself going a lot of different places, some of which are a little easier access than others. And I would say I'm all three. And so that time of life where you're just curious and you want to find out about the city and you're willing to go, a little bit further than at other times of life, and in doing so, it is a great time, and it's something that I really value, and it's something I wrote a book about, and it's something that I have a lot of fond memories of, but it's also something that's for a certain time of life. And as somebody who has a lot of sleepless nights and daycare duty right now, it's not the current time in life, I can tell you that.
Yeah, I feel you. If anyone wants to get into these secret dark stories and spaces, definitely check out Hidden Cities. But I gotta ask Moses, have you been in the tubes for the New York subway?
In the subway tunnels?
Yeah,
Oh, there's a bunch of fun stuff in the subway tunnels.
yeah,
Uh,
that's on my bucket
I,
list
I
for
can't
sure.
uh, I can't say I have not. No.
Okay, great. So Moses joined RPA back in 2016, so he's been here just about a decade. And that was right around the time when we were finishing up developing the fourth regional plan. So can you tell us a little bit about your work for the fourth regional plan?
Sure. So after grad school, I got a job with a nonprofit affordable housing developer, doing just kind of nuts and bolts affordable housing development. And from there, I went to the Association for Neighborhood Housing Development, which is kind of the umbrella organization for these nonprofit developers. And I got away from the nuts and bolts and got a little bit more into policy and affordable housing policy and how to change things at the city or the state level to make it easier to build better housing and more affordable housing. And that's really when I went over to RPA after I think 7 years at ANHD, was in the middle of the fourth plan, and I was really brought on to develop the housing recommendations for the plan and to kind of take that experience and knowledge and translate it into the regional level and the kind of even a higher policy level, I would say. And the fourth plan was a great time, and I got to work on housing, but I also got to work on a lot of other things. And as somebody who just loves the city, I was really happy to get to kind of expand beyond that nonprofit affordable housing world a little bit. And I've stuck around ever since because it's a great place to work, and I get to be a professional New Yorker.
That's right. And I think the biggest thing probably when people think about, a long-term regional plan and the outlook, because, regional plans are meant to last for at least 20 years, maybe more, 25, a generational outlook. I think the biggest thing has been affordability and really driving housing stock. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so New York City has always been expensive. And if you dig back in the history books, there was never a time when people did not fetch about the expense of the city. But it just keeps getting worse. You know, you look in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, and you look at how much people paid as a percentage of their income in housing costs, and it's a lot less than happens now. And in the 1970s, which is when a lot of people think of New York City as being at its most affordable. That was when we declared our housing emergency and instituted a law called the Emergency Tenant Protection Act because we thought that our housing crunch and crisis was so bad and we did not have the ability to have a rational housing market and had to institute essentially rent stabilization in order to provide a little stability for folks. So, and that happened in what a lot of people think of as the 70s. It wasn't, New York, the economy wasn't so great. The city was a little bit of a mess. You could go get a loft in Soho for a song. That's kind of the story that people have of New York at that time. And even in those times, our housing crunch was bad enough to engender state action on rent stabilization. So, I just want to stress that it's always been bad, but it's just continued to get worse as the decades have gone
Yeah, and affordability I
on.
think is really top of mind, and that kind of state level action, I'm hoping we'll see more of that in the future to help address this. But getting back to the charter revision proposals, I think they're largely aimed at trying to address the housing stock and the process to bring more housing online and to develop more housing. So we'll get into that, you know, into the details of that. That's what we want to do for this episode. And now that we know a little bit more about Moses and his background, let's dive into the charter revision proposals. So as I said at the beginning, there's 6 total proposals that folks will see on their ballots, but we're going to dive into proposals 2, 3, 4, and 5, since they're aimed at improving housing stock, the process of developing it, and thus affordability. More stock, more affordability. That's the way the logic goes. So in case any listeners aren't going to take notes during this, Moses and our senior associate for digital media, Meaghan McElroy, put together a really handy voter guide. It's on our website, but we'll link to it in the show notes. And so all of this information will be there in case listeners want to get into it. Okay, so the first proposal, which is proposal number 2 that we're going to cover, will be on the ballot. If you vote down ballot or turn your ballot over, you'll see it. The ballot language itself. We'll give you exactly what you'll see on the ballot, but the second one is called Proposed Charter Amendment, Fast Track Affordable Housing to Build More Affordable Housing in the City. Okay, so what does this fast track language say? So it says fast track publicly financed affordable housing, fast track applications delivering affordable housing in community districts that produce the least affordable housing, significantly reducing review time, and they'll maintain community board review. That sounds a little bit esoteric. Essentially, it'll say voting yes on this will fast track applications to the Board of Standards and Appeals or the City Planning Commission. And if you vote no, it'll leave affordable housing subject to a longer review, and the final decision will rest with City Council. Can you unpack for us a little bit of what this amendment is trying to get at and a little bit of the politics that are at play here?
Yeah, so I'm going to have to go all the way back and start at the beginning. In order to develop anything in New York City that is not as of right, and by as of right, it means the zoning says it can be built already. The zoning says you're allowed to build a certain stories, a certain lot coverage, a certain size building. Is that what you want to build? Great, you can do it. Do you want to build something different? Not necessarily even something different in terms of it's larger, but maybe just a different configuration. You need to go through a process called ULURP, which is a Uniform Land Use Review Process, which is, in my opinion, a pretty good process for a lot of different land use changes. You go to your community board, you tell them what they want to do. The community board says, we like this idea, we don't like this idea, we like this idea, but we'd like to see these couple of things changed about it. But they give an advisory opinion. Then you go to the borough president. The borough president does the same thing. After that, you start to get into the entities that have actual voting power, not just recommendation power. One is the City Planning Commission, which is a commission where the majority of the members, but not all of the members, are appointed by the mayor. But I should stress they're independent appointees. They're appointed for a fixed term. And their job is to take a objective and professional look at these land use changes and decide if they make sense or not. And then after that, it goes to the city council, our legislative body, to also approve. The city planning commission and the city council both have to approve the exact same thing. If they approve something somewhat different, it has to kind of goes back and forth until they both agree. So this is something that makes sense in a lot of cases. If you're trying to build, a giant skyscraper in the middle of Manhattan, probably you want to go through this process. It's something that's designed for transparency, and it's something that's designed so that our elected officials and our city planning professionals kind of take a good look at it and make sure it makes sense for the city. But it is long. It's not ridiculously long. There are other cities that have a longer process. But it is long. It is expensive to do a lot of the environmental review that's needed to do before you start this. And there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that kind of make it a little bit longer. And so as a result, it's good for some things, but it's not necessarily good for everything. And affordable housing, a lot of times, is the kind of thing where, we need to build it quicker. There's already, we already know that there is a public purpose for it. And it's the kind of thing where we're looking to build affordable housing to address our affordability crisis. Land use is more about density and neighborhood character. And as a result, when you go through this ULURP process, it's not really supposed to be about an individual building. It's really discouraged to do what's called a spot rezoning and to just say, I want to build this thing. Let's rezone this one parcel to make it so I can build this thing. That's not like the purpose behind it. So as a result, a lot of times if you're trying to build an affordable housing development, you do this weird Rube Goldberg thing where you kind of rezone the whole, a larger area, not necessarily an entire neighborhood, but maybe a block or a little bit more of the block than where you want to build. And then you have to do all the environmental review and analysis for that, and then it goes through the whole process. And then, there's even times where then everything but your building gets taken out at the end. And it's just a lot of process and it's a lot of expense and it's a lot of uncertainty And as a result, a lot of times nonprofits or other developers that have a site that want to build housing, affordable housing, that know how it can pencil out best, that know how it fits with the existing programs to produce the most housing at the most in the most efficient way, they don't want to go through all of that, and we end up losing out on a lot of development sites. So by having this alternative structure, you know, which is just another option, we can address these affordable housing buildings on their merits as affordable housing buildings and say, we need this affordable housing. We want to build this specific affordable housing building. And here's a process to just do that, as opposed to kind of putting it through this longer, more complicated, more roundabout process.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there's a bit of a scale problem. Like this was developed for larger scale, wider areas to be approved to be rezoned. But for these smaller scale projects that perhaps already kind of neatly fit into the footprint geography of where they're going to be built, that they're getting hung up in, a really valid but in thorough review process that maybe doesn't need to apply to developments of a smaller scale. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up this question of scale, because there's something that I think a lot of people don't have a real accurate understanding of when it comes to New York City. A lot of folks think of New York City as just like big buildings, skyscrapers. The things we build are 60-story apartment buildings, and that's New York City, the New York City of Manhattan, or maybe kind of like our waterfront neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens or a couple of other places. And that's how we're going to get housing, and that's how we're the kind of development that goes on, and that's our path to creating more apartments and creating more housing. And that's an important part of it, but it is not the biggest part. New York is, to a large extent, when you're looking at the five boroughs, a mid-rise city. And if you just chose a random corner on Google Maps, and maybe I'll even try to do this right now. I'm zooming out from Google Maps. I'm getting the little figure. I'm closing my eyes and I'm dropping them. Here's what I see on this corner of the Bronx on Google Maps. I'm on East 150th and Fox Street. Here's what's on this block. There is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 story apartment building next to a 6 story apartment building. On the other side of this street, it looks like this looks like semi-attached duplexes, I'm fairly sure. A kind of modest building with 4 housing units in it. We turn the corner and we have attached row house housing. This is what New York looks like. New York doesn't look like here's a detached house on a large lot, here's a skyscraper. It looks like this mid-rise character. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories, a lot of attached, semi-attached, a lot of, that kind of like real neighborhood character. And we cannot build this scale anymore. We kind of have two options. We leave a lot of our lower rise neighborhoods as it is. We don't really have the option of building this kind of housing there. Or we take that same neighborhood, in order to make it worth it, we propose the biggest thing possible, because that's what makes it worth it when we have to go through this big long process and the only folks who really are able to do that are, these big developers proposing big stuff. Your neighborhood contractor isn't going to be able to go through that to build a 6 story apartment building. And this costs us not only housing, it costs us a lot of jobs. It costs us a lot of economic advancement from kind of our neighborhood contractors, developers,
Yeah, small
and small
businesses,
businesses.
yeah.
So it really is a part in New York that we used to have. We used to produce a lot of housing this way. You can see it because it's the housing we have now. And since about the early 2000s, we did a lot of zoning actions to really prevent this kind of development. Getting back to this development, getting back to this scale, is really important. It's important for our small businesses. It's hugely important for our housing. It's hugely important for our neighborhoods. It's something that I really strongly believe is like firmly in what New York is and what New York needs to be. And having this process that makes this possible again. And now I'm kind of on to the next ballot question. I think it's like vitally important.
Great segue. So,
Yeah.
okay. So the first one addresses the scale question and
Yep.
provides more speed and certainty by making the first stop instead of going back to city council, the city planning commission, they can, approve it
Yep.
and it's approved. The next one is about simplifying the review process for housing and infrastructure projects. The actual ballot question will read, simplify review of modest amounts of additional housing and minor infrastructure projects to reduce the review time. It'll maintain community board review, but the final decision will be with the city planning commission. So yes, simplifies the review for limited small land use changes. No, leaves the changes to the longer ULURP process with final decision by city council. So it's essentially a continuation of the first proposal. So
Yeah,
yeah, take it from there.
and this is something that's really important because again, with the scale, we're talking about building an 80-story skyscraper and raising a street 6 inches, having the same process,
Yeah.
right? And we need to be able to do these kind of small, simple fixes in a city as big and complicated as New York without going through the same process that we use to do a really large, impactful rezoning or development. And this is not just about the time and it's not just about the money, it's about the certainty. And it's about making sure that the projects that we want to do are addressed on their own merits. And that's having the city planning commission make the decision looking at it as planning professionals. When you have these kind of small projects that need to go through full environmental review, full city council votes, you get into a lot of things like you go through the entire process, but it's the end of the city council term. Now that city council person is out, now a new person is in, they have different considerations. They want to go through the whole thing again. Maybe it gets caught up in other political considerations because these are elected officials we're talking about here. It's just the kind of thing that can get into a realm that isn't really meant for these kind of small projects. Building a 4-story building, raising a street 6 inches to have some more flood protection, adding a couple of stories to what's allowed in our mid-rise districts. So making sure that these smaller projects have the right process for them that's a smaller scale to fit these smaller scale projects is important to make sure our city works right.
Yeah, about keeping the political input and considerations at the biggest scale of development because it impacts the most people and using this expedited land use review process, ELURP instead of ULURP for these smaller scale projects, I think makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about a large neighborhood rezoning or when we're talking about, a big commercial skyscraper in the middle of a business district, or we're talking about these big proposals, they're complicated and I don't think it's untoward to have it be, a little bit longer and more complicated process. And I also don't think it's untoward to have our elected officials weigh in on what it means in terms of infrastructure needs, what it means in terms of kind of other considerations, and to be able to do a little bit of negotiation representing their constituents and getting kind of the best things for their neighborhood when there's this big impactful thing happening in their neighborhoods. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that the Euler process that we have for that is really good and has resulted in a lot of really good rezonings and a lot of good kind of comprehensive neighborhood plans. But it's obviously, not the kind of thing that like raising a street 6 inches rises to, or uh, building semi-attached housing instead of detached housing, or these kind of smaller projects. It doesn't rise to that level, and we have to make sure that the level is appropriate for what the project is.
And I think a lot of listeners would probably even be surprised to learn that things like that, smaller scale changes, either infrastructure, road, or, to housing, development styles, even go through this same process. I mean, to me, I think just knowing that and getting that message out is really important so that when you make a change like this from the one size fits all ULERP process to, the expedited process, I think that is, very much common sense and allows for those that what we would call gentle density, missing middle, small changes that actually add to the housing stock but don't drastically change neighborhood character. I think a
Yeah,
lot of people should be able to get behind that.
absolutely. And they add the kind of buildings that New York City has all over the place. That it really is what the built environment in New York City looks like.
Okay, so the proposal two changes the path of review to kind of shortcut it to the city planning commission kind of having the say and um, just shortens the path of review to fewer stakeholders. Proposal three creates the expedited review process instead of the full ULERP. All right, so let's move on to question four,
Yep.
which is establish an affordable housing appeals board with council, the borough president, and citywide representation. So when voters look at their ballot, it'll say establish affordable housing appeals board with city council speaker, local borough president, and mayor review. They'll review council's actions that reject or change applications. Voting yes creates a three-member affordable housing appeals board to reflect those three perspectives, council, the borough president, and citywide. And voting no leaves the affordable housing subject to mayor veto and the final decision with city council. Can you talk us through why this appeal board is necessary and how it helps with the development process?
Yeah, so I don't actually think that this appeals board will get used a huge amount. I think it's really valuable because it's valuable to provide a different path in instances where one elected official, who is the local council person, is able to hold up what I would call a common sense project, right?
Yeah.
So the way that city council sometimes works, and I should stress this is not something that's written into our legal system. It's just kind of an informal understanding,
Hmm.
is that we have 51 city council people. They all represent a specific neighborhood. And the general understanding is if something's in your neighborhood, it's your business. And if it's not in your neighborhood, it's not your business. And so we end up with this process called member deference, which is the local city council person says, I like this, I don't like this. And the rest of the city council kind of goes along, as opposed to every city council person looking at every uh, proposed development and formulating their own opinions on it. And that's kind of it doesn't always happen, and there are exceptions, and there's times when it's happened more and happened less, but it is more or less what tends to happen in I would say the vast majority of land use cases. So this leads to one elected official who's not even elected by the entire city of New York. They're only elected by one neighborhood, being able to hold up common sense affordable housing projects that are really needed and really important to
And that's because of the
because of
customary.
the customary member deference, and
Yep.
really important to uh, affordability in New York. And I can think of several of them. But there's always a reason it doesn't fit in with neighborhood characters, is one of the more reasonable reasons. Sometimes they're, in my opinion, based on a lot of misunderstanding about people and folks who live in affordable housing that's you know, I would call ill-informed in the politest manner.
Mhm.
So in order to be able to make sure that there's another path to building these kind of needed and common sense projects, okay, let's ask some other elected officials, right? And if two out of those three elected officials agree, well, maybe that is, an actual common sense project that's needed. So that's what that appeals board does. It brings more elected officials into the conversation to say, actually, this makes a lot of sense, and one elected official who's not even elected by the whole city shouldn't be able to hold it up. Like I said, I don't think this will get used a whole lot. I think it will get used, and I think it is important and impactful, but I don't think it's going to be, happening 3 times a week or anything like that. Um, it's really for those instances where you have city council people who aren't acting in the best interest of the city and having a mechanism to make sure that those projects are able to happen.
Yeah, and you said something that I think we should talk about a little bit where, there's some people on city council in some neighborhoods that really want, I mean, they're hardcore NIMBYs. They don't want any development. They'll use, any reason under the books to prevent any new development. We saw this during the fight over the City of Yes rezoning package. Some neighborhoods do as much as possible, and some neighborhoods really don't do their part. And can you talk about kind of how these proposals as a package could help even out, the load across the city?
Yeah, so that's a really great part about these ballot projects that we haven't talked about yet, is that there would also be a fast track to approve affordable housing projects in the neighborhoods that have not built their fair share of affordable housing. Um, so what would happen is we would look at by neighborhood who's built affordable housing and who hasn't. And we need affordable housing everywhere, right? We
Mhm.
know this. It's kind of an obvious thing. Whatever neighborhood you're living in New York, like your rent is probably too high or your housing prices are too high. And I don't think that it's a stretch to say that more affordable housing, what in whatever neighborhood you're in, is something that's needed. But the problem is some neighborhoods do a really good job of this, as you pointed out, and some don't. And so making sure that there is another path to making sure that those neighborhoods that have historically not really done their share in a city that, is all of our cities, that's something that these ballot proposals would also do. They would make an expedited process in those, specifically in those neighborhoods that have not produced, that have produced the lowest amount of affordable housing to be able to do more.
Yeah, and that's part of the first proposal
Yeah,
by saying, yes, you're creating this affordable housing fast track so that those community districts that promote the least can avail themselves of this and get it done faster.
exactly.
Yeah, that's definitely important. And again, I know we're kind of jumping a little bit around because it's a package of proposals that work together to improve housing stock and the production
Mhm.
process. So again, I'd encourage listeners to check out the show notes and our lab on this that does a deep dive. Okay, so, bottom line, why they should support these. The proposed appeal board allows more elected officials to have a voice instead of just member deference. It allows for the veto, and the rest of city council will follow it. So I think that's pretty clear. The last proposal, Proposal 5, is kind of really shocked me when I read, the commission's initial report and then saw the rest of the ballot questions come out. Proposal 5 asks voters if we should create a digitized map of the city. Now, when I read that, I couldn't believe that there wasn't an official digitized map of the city. So for Moses, for the uninitiated, could you explain how the borough maps of New York work and why they're not digitized? Like why do we need this ballot proposal?
So you can go on the internet and find a digitized map of New York City, right? And even if you go to the Department of City Planning or to other official city sites, We have these wonderful digitized maps where you can look up the zoning and you can look up all these other things. So we have that technical capacity. What those maps are is not official. They're all unofficial maps.
Hmm.
This is despite the fact that probably it's a little bit more accurate in 2025 to be able to make these changes on a digital map than go to Borough Hall during working business hours, ask the person at Borough Hall in charge of these maps, some of whom I know, and some of whom are some of my favorite people, I have to say, to pull out this giant, I want to say it's like 2 foot by 3 foot map that's a section of the borough that has all of these annotations on it in, handwritten, and have to physically make those changes to the paper map to officially change where a street is, where a lot line is, whatever the official legal change needs to be made is just really behind the times, I would
To say the least, yeah.
to say the least. So this one is a very common sense kind of thing. Me as a professional New Yorker, as an urban planner, as a map nerd, I love the paper maps. Like, I think it's super fun. I think it's super cool. I love the map rooms in the borough halls, but it's not the way to run a city. Come on. I'm
Yes,
a
they could
big
go in the historical archive, but we shouldn't be amending maps by hand and then digitizing them.
100%. So it's the kind of thing where I very much hope that we keep the maps, but I hope that we keep them, like you said, more as a historical resource, more for intellectual purposes and not for official purposes. Let's move into the 21st century already.
Yeah. So proposal five, yes, creates a consolidated digital map of the city, creates an automatic process for these updates that doesn't involve hand drawing on real maps. No, leaves the five separate maps in the borough president offices in place. And so I think it's pretty easy to say New Yorkers should vote yes on this one. It's pretty low-hanging fruit, which is kind of surprising. Moses, any other final thoughts on these ballot proposals, why folks should, support them and the impact they'll have on the city?
Yeah, I think that we all know the problems. We all know the affordability problems. We all know the need to be more of a modern city when it comes to these kind of things. We all know the problems. What we now have before us is a solution. In order to get affordability, we really need two components. The first thing we need, and the baseline, is we need to be able to build more. We need to be able to build more because of supply and demand and all of that. We need to be able to build more because we have a lot of housing vouchers that we're not able to use because our housing supply is so constrained. The baseline for any kind of affordability is opportunity. And we do not have the opportunity in New York because we have not built enough to keep up with the economy, to keep up with the folks who want to live here. And the proposals to be able to restore that building and restore it in a way that New York has traditionally done, this kind of mid-rise housing, is extremely important. But then also the proposals to fast track dedicated affordable housing are a way to get there more directly and to get there quicker. And I will quote a late friend of mine, Tom Waters, who worked for a community service society for a long time. And his line was always, the best way to add affordable housing is to add affordable housing.
Amen.
And making it easier to build, to purpose build that affordable housing is also a huge way to make sure that we don't have to just wait for everything to kind of filter down and hope that we're able to build enough to make a rational ecosystem. We're able to address it quicker, more directly for the folks who need it the most. And so that's why I really encourage folks to vote yes on all of these proposals, visit a map room in one of the borough halls if you can. They're really fun. Um, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if the upcoming Open House New York weekend, a lot of the borough halls are open and you could see some of those map rooms. Visit the map rooms. It's really cool. It's really fun. It will 100% convince you that we need to have a consolidated digital map as an official city map. So I will leave you on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say one of the first dates my wife and I went on was to the New York Public Library's map room. So
Hmm.
we love maps here. We don't want to get rid of these maps. They are historical treasures. We just want to be able to update and consolidate them digitally. So that's it for us in New York. Moses Gates, thank you so much for joining RPA Radio. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Excellent. Thanks so much for having me, and maybe we'll do another one of these sometime.
Yep, sounds good. Remember, think regionally, act locally, and vote yes on all the ballot proposals. Thanks so much.
RPA Radio is produced by Bowden Akbari for Regional Plan Association. Editing is by Meaghan McElroy. Our theme music is by Nate Dorr. Questions or comments? Email us at info@rpa.org or visit rpa.org for more.